Hi, and welcome to this Funds Network Pensions Technical video where we're taking a look at written diploma and advanced diploma exams exam technique. Now, just a few comments initially on the general approach to take when sitting a written diploma exam or a written advanced diploma exam with the Chartered Insurance Institute. First of all, always attempt any calculations, even if you aren't sure of the process involved, and write down all of the stages in the calculation. Now, the reason I say that is simply because in the marking scheme, there will be 1 mark for getting the correct answer at the end of the calculation. Every other mark will be for the stages or process involved in coming to that final mark. The good news is, even if you make a mistake at some point during the calculation process, you will only lose that 1 mark for that one part of the calculation process. Even if you take the incorrect figure that you've just worked out and run with it correctly from that point onwards for the remainder of the calculation, you can still pick up all of the remaining marks in the calculation, including the final mark. It's known as follow-through marking. So always make sure you put down all the stages of the process and don't leave any out. Don't forget that there are no marks lost for untidy handwriting. But let's be honest, you're not making the examiner's life any easier if they can't actually read what you've written. So take whatever steps you can to try and make your handwriting as legible as possible. So for example, make sure you dot your I's, make sure you cross your T's, make sure your G's and your Y's are clearly distinguishable, just to make it that little bit easier for the examiner to actually understand the point you're making. If you do have poor handwriting, don't use block capitals. The simple fact is, yes, it will make it more legible, but it'll just slow you down too much. So don't go down that route. One way of speeding yourself up is, rather than writing long free-flowing block paragraphs, use bullet points. Now, the other advantage of bullet points is not only does it speed you up, but it also makes it clear to the examiner what the points are that you're making. So it's easier for them to actually identify your points and compare them with the marking scheme. It's also good from your perspective because the question will always tell you the number of marks available, and what you can then try and do is tally up the number of bullet points with the number of marks that are available. Where appropriate, use tables. Tables can be particularly useful where the question's asking you about the benefits and drawbacks of a particular approach. So you can have one column in the table for benefits, another column in the table for drawbacks. It can also be useful where the question is asking you to identify and describe, or identify and explain. So in the one column, you identify a feature or an aspect of a product or a solution, and then you describe it in the matching column so that you don't miss out on any points. Do make sure when you reach the end of a question that you leave plenty of space between it and the next part of the question or the next entirely new question. The reason for that being that you may find some inspiration strikes further down the line in the paper, and you can come back and you've got room to add any further points. Whereas if you haven't left that space, you'll be jotting down notes here, there and everywhere, and it may be that the examiner doesn't pick up on them. So those are just some general thoughts on the approach to take to a written diploma and advanced diploma exam. What about when you actually start to answer the questions in the exam? What's the step or the series of steps that you should be taking in this regard? Well, the first thing you should do is read through the questions at the beginning of the exam. So if it's a diploma exam, you've got 15 short answer questions. Read through all of them and identify the questions that you feel are your strongest questions, and start with those first. Don't leave them to last. Quite simply, if you do leave them to last and try and get the weaker ones out the way first, you may find yourself with not enough time to pick up the marks that you could otherwise have picked up because they are your strongest areas. If it's a case study based exam and you've got 3 case studies, then read the questions, identify the case study that you feel you're going to do best in, and start with that particular case study, answering all of the questions in relation to it. Don't jump between case studies answering a question here and a question there, because you'll only end up missing out questions and get a bit confused. Make sure you read the question at least twice before answering it. And the reason for that is we have a tendency to focus on particular keywords, or words jump out at us that we're more familiar with, and then we end up potentially answering a question that we weren't actually asked. So the second read through allows you to pull out the subtleties of the question and just make sure that you actually answer the question that you're being asked. So you need to be crystal clear what it is that you are being asked by the question. Now, part of that is spotting the verb. In other words, the instruction to the candidate. Are you being asked to explain? Are you being asked to describe, to calculate, to list, to state the benefits and drawbacks? What is it that the examiner actually wants you to do? Make sure that you understand what those instructions mean. And one of the best ways of doing that is to look through past papers, look for the instructions to the candidates, and then look at how the marking scheme responds to those instructions so that you're clear what it is you're required to do. Make sure you relate your answers to the specifics in the question or case study. All too often candidates come out of exams, feel they've done very well, and then they fail. And very often the reason for that is because their answers were just generic knowledge-based answers. They didn't tie their answers in to the actual scenario that's provided for them. Now, that's less of an issue where you're dealing with a short answer exam, where the scenarios were going to be very brief inevitably, but when you're having to deal with case studies, you really do need to make sure wherever possible, and it isn't always possible, but wherever possible, that you tie in your answer to the client's scenario and to their objectives and to their circumstances as provided in the case study. Do take the time at the beginning of your answer to actually mentally structure it. Now, what I mean by that is you read through the question twice, you identify the verb, the instruction that you are supposed to respond to as a candidate. What you then do is you say, right, this question has got X amount of marks available to it. What is the general shape of my answer? What is the breadth of my answer? What are the key points that I feel need to be made? Compare that to the number of marks available and then determine the depth of your answer. In other words, how much detail you need to go into in order to match up with the marking scheme. There's absolutely no point putting down 4 bullet points for a 10-mark question, but equally there's no point putting down 10 bullet points for a 4-mark question. So you have to gauge the breadth of your answer and then the level of detail, the depth of your answer to match it up with the number of marks available. Now, typically, there's going to be 1 mark available in the marking scheme for each substantive point or each step in a calculation that you make. Don't forget to watch your time. Too many times people come out of these exams and say, oh, I ran out of time. There's no reason that you should run out of time if every time you start a question, you look at the number of marks and then you allocate 1 minute per mark roughly to answer that question. And then literally you have to have the self-discipline to walk away, to leave a space, to come back to it later and move on to another question. Now, that's good exam technique because typically the marks that you're putting down right at the end will be the ones that are less likely to score the marks because your most pertinent and key points will be the ones you thought of first. So do have that self-discipline to judge the number of marks, judge the amount of time, and be willing to walk away and come back to it later. How do you approach an answer when you're doing a written diploma or advanced diploma exam? Well, assume that the examiner knows absolutely nothing about the topic that you're explaining, that they're a novice. And remember that all they know is what you write down in the exam paper. You may know it in your head, but if you don't put it down, they don't know what you know. So in other words, state the blindingly obvious. A number of occasions people will come out of an exam, they'll find later what the marking scheme was and they'll realise, oh, I knew that, but I didn't put it down. Well, do put it down. And if you've any doubts, do put it down, particularly when you're dealing with fact-finding or list-type questions. Don't sit on the fence or be ambiguous. If you are required to recommend a course of action or you really aren't sure what to do, you're going to have to just nail it and go down one particular path and have the strength of your convictions. Don't hedge your bets and don't contradict yourself. What the CII do is they operate a process called positive marking. So in other words, they are looking for reasons to give you marks, but you have to give them enough of a reason to give you that mark. And what they don't allow, however, is for you to contradict yourself. You can't say something is black and that something is equally white, because clearly in that situation you don't know which one's which and you don't know which one's the right answer. In that case, you simply won't get the mark. Don't forget that examiners have no discretion and they can't award marks for implied answers. They may think that you know what you're talking about, but if you haven't actually written it down, they can't give you the mark. Also, don't forget that just because you've put down a really good answer, if it's not on the marking scheme, unfortunately, you won't get that mark. Now, talking about marks, it's useful to consider where the marks are within a written diploma or advanced diploma exam. Now remember, marks are awarded for key or pertinent points. Also remember that there will be many more relevant, accurate points than there are marks available. Sometimes you'll look at a marking scheme after an exam's been released and you'll think, well, why doesn't it say this? Why doesn't it say that? That to my mind is perfectly valid. Well, the problem is you're not the examiner. You're not the one who sets the marking scheme, and it's what's on the marking scheme that's what counts. One way of dealing with this is, for example, if you have an 8-mark question, write down 10 or 11 points in relation to the answer. That way, if you've written down 2 or 3 things that aren't on the marking scheme, hopefully the other 8 things that you wrote down will pick up the 8 marks. Don't worry about that approach from the point of view of, will the examiner stop marking after the first 8? Well, the answer is they won't. They will keep marking until you've got all 8 marks, and then they'll stop marking. The only thing you need to be careful of when doing that is that you don't run out of time. So don't over-egg that particular pudding from the point of view of writing loads and loads and loads of bullet points. Just write a few extra just in case you need them. The bottom line is the CII decides what gets the mark. You might not agree with it, but then again, you don't set the exam and you're not marking it. Also, don't forget, another good reason for doing this is that you don't know which points actually attract the marks. So hence, it's good practice to write down a few additional points over and above what's absolutely required. Remember, what you're doing in an exam is you're combining your own knowledge and experience with the published CII exam materials, including the past papers, and by combining those two, hopefully, what you'll end up doing is you'll maximize your chances of success. Thank you for watching.